So my name is Kyle Rankin. I have been involved in Linux for like about 25 years or so. In the past, I've written a number of books for a couple different publishers on Linux. Some people might know me from my Linux Journal column I did for many years. Right now I work in computer infrastructure and security. But that's not what we're going to talk about today, really. We're going to talk about using Nextcloud as a self-hosted cross-platform cloud. So first, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate everyone coming out. Last track of the day, of the last day. So after lunch, we'll see what we can do to keep this as entertaining as possible, since you're going to start digesting here in a little bit, and it's a warm room. There's some white noise. It's going to be, and my voice is very soothing, I know. So we'll see what we can do. All right, let's go. All right, so as an introduction, I'm a long-time self-hoster. I self-host a lot of services. So I've, for the longest time, self-hosted my own email. I've self-hosted my own websites, DNS, because I'm a sysadmin, right? And so it's not labor for me to host my own stuff, because it's what I did for my day job forever. So it's very easy and straightforward. And I set it up a long time ago, all these services, when I first got into systems administration. So maintaining it for me is no big deal, right? It's sort of like, you might be surprised if someone who's a mechanic by trade doesn't change their own oils. Yeah, this is no big deal. I do this all day long. I can do it on my own car. It's not a problem. That said, I did use some big tech groupware type stuff. Mostly I'm talking about things like Google Calendar for the longest time. If you would get an Android device, it's very convenient to use your Google account to have your calendars be there in sync, and then you can share calendars with people, and that's a really common use case. And it's I didn't ideally like to do that. I had some sort of questions about the fact that I was sharing all the things that I did in my life with a provider that was going to obviously market based on that, but I still used it. And then there was this process I went through where I was how could I reduce or completely remove the amount of Google in my life? I think a number of people, maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, or started this sort of process of re-examining when people started becoming more aware of privacy implications of some of these services. How much can I reduce my dependency on this? And so in my case, I started looking around and sort of grabbing these different areas where, do I really need to use Google for this particular thing or not? Can I find an alternative? And in particular, one of the ones that I was left with was I needed some sort of shared calendaring solution that wasn't Google Calendar, because my wife and I both had been using Google Calendar with our accounts, and that we would share our calendars with each other. It kind of makes sense. So looked around for alternatives. This is a number of years ago now, and I discovered Nextcloud. Well, I kind of knew about Nextcloud, but I realized, you know what, that actually might be a good solution for me just for calendaring. So tried out Nextcloud Calendar. And then as my extended family started adding other devices, in particular Apple devices, we started expanding our use of Nextcloud to make it a little bit easier. There's a lot of things which we'll get into in the talk about why this is beneficial, but how we use Nextcloud started to change when we started adding these other devices into our family. And now I would say that Nextcloud is probably critical, if not just key, but probably critical to having this really easy cross-platform life where we have all these different devices with all these different operating systems. I'm trying to get them all to integrate really well. I found that Nextcloud to be kind of central to that. It's essentially, in many ways, like a self-hosted iCloud. There's a lot. It doesn't have 100% of the feature sets that iCloud does, but it also does some things that iCloud doesn't do. But all of the things that you would typically care about from a syncing between devices type thing, it does really well. And so it has a lot of the same features. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about what Nextcloud is, talk through some of the self-hosting options that you might want to choose if you want to do it yourself. Talk about my setup in particular, sort of how I host it. And then I will discuss a little bit on how you integrate Nextcloud with Linux. That'll sort of lead into a general purpose discussion of the native app. So Nextcloud has a native app for many platforms. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about there's a couple different ways that you can integrate with Nextcloud, and the native app is when I'm going to talk about why you might want to use the native app. Then I'm going to talk about how to integrate with the Apple ecosystem using Nextcloud. And then finally, I'm going to give a couple of actual real-life anecdotes from myself and my family of how we've used Nextcloud to have a nice cross-platform life. So what is Nextcloud? So Nextcloud is an open source groupware solution. It was hard to, because the word cloud has been so overloaded these days, like I was like, what's the actual word for what I'm talking about? I guess I'm kind of talking about groupware because that was like the best word I could come up with for kind of what it does, because it does so many things. But it's a similar feature set to like Google groupware, so how Google would have like calendaring and docs and things like that, and also iCloud, like I mentioned before. By default, you have this nice web-based UI. It's very easy to use. You log in and you can do pretty much everything that you would want to do from a web browser. That said, it also has native integration with native applications for all the major platforms you'd want to use it on, so that you can integrate with Nextcloud that way as well. There's also a big community around Nextcloud. I mean, this is not a brand new project. This has been going on for many, many years. There's a lot of third-party modules that the community has developed. There's extra modules that Nextcloud itself has developed that can extend what it can do beyond just sort of basic feature set, which is already pretty great. So some example modules, some of these are third-party and some of these are core modules, but these are the ones that I've personally used with Nextcloud is files. So this is similar to like a Google Docs type feature where you have a web-based UI that you can go in, you can store files there, you can view those files, you can share those files with other people on the internet, you can get, or other people that have Nextcloud accounts with you, you can share the files with. You can also provide shareable links to people outside of your account, if it can be a nice solution for that. And so in general, it does a lot of the things that GDocs might do for you. Calendar, we've talked about that a lot already. It has a nice web-based calendar application that's pretty easy to use, and calendar integration. Contacts, so you can share and sync contacts with Nextcloud. It sort of goes part and parcel with calendaring. You want to have contacts as well, and it has a great basic contact web app. It has an office suite. There's actually a couple of different modules that provide this in different ways, but you can essentially think of this how Google Docs, or I guess Files is closer to G Drive, where Office would be more like G Docs, where you can live edit. You can not just go to Files and see that there is a document or a spreadsheet. You can actually open that within the web UI and edit it just like you might on like Google groupware or things like that. It has that feature. News. So I was one of the many people that were disappointed when Google Reader was killed. That was the way that I read my news forever. I loved the fact that it had VI key bindings that let you JK up and down the news and go next story, next story. You just, in great RSS, web-based RSS reader for news. The way that it organized news was great. And when it went away, I very much missed it. And obviously there's 5 million alternatives to it that are trying to mimic the functionality. However, one of them is Nextcloud News, and it provides a lot of the same types of interfaces that would be used to with Google Reader, and this is what I use for my RSS reader now. And there's a mail application. There's actually a couple of different third-party mail modules that you can use, but web-based email, like you might be used to in other platforms, you can plug it right into Nextcloud and have it all there. So. One of the reasons we're talking about this here is to self-host this. One of the reasons I wanted to move away from a third-party provider was I wanted the ability to have more control over what I was doing and my data. And there's a lot of different options that Nextcloud provides. The details are actually on their site, so I'm not going to go into, here's how you install it this way, here's how you install it that way, because however you want to do it will be a little bit different, but you can go to the site for details. But for example, there's some third-party Nextcloud providers that if you would like this feature that holds only your data, but you don't want to go to the trouble of maintaining and administering it yourself, there are third-party providers that will provide Nextcloud as a service essentially, that through presumably some fee you can pay them, and then you can have an account on their cloud, as it were. There's also self-hosted cloud options, and by that there are cloud images for all the major cloud providers that you can get to where if you have a cloud account on like AWS or whatever, you can host it yourself without having to worry about infrastructure at your house. So that's an option, and like I said, the website lists a lot of the different choices there. And then finally, there's self-hosted hardware options. There's a couple of different avenues by which you can install this server on a lot of different hardware. including things like Raspberry Pis, like especially now that, I mean, you've been able to run it on a Raspberry Pi for a long time, but now that Raspberry Pis are incredibly capable, like big, fast computers, it's actually a really good choice for many people, especially for just like your home and doing things like that. But Raspberry Pi, regular server, anything that runs Linux, they have install options. The thing I really like about Nextcloud is, from an administrator standpoint, compared to a lot of the other self-hosted things I do, maintaining it is very simple. It's very easy to upgrade. They've done a lot of I wish actually a lot of other services approached upgrading the way that Nextcloud does, and made it as easy to use. When it's time for an update, you'll get like a notification. In the interface, you can go to the settings, and it will tell you about the upgrade, and you just basically say, yes, please upgrade, and it does all the things you would want to do as an administrator to properly upgrade a system, like go into a maintenance mode, perform a backup, download the thing, check the integrity, all those things, apply the changes, then exit maintenance mode. It does all of that for you within the web UI and tells you that it succeeded, and then you move on with your life. So you don't necessarily have to be some sort of hardcore sysadmin to host this yourself. Everything is done through the web UI. After you install it, and maybe not even after you install it, depending on how you install it, you may not have to interact very much with the terminal if you don't want to administer this. All right, so what's my setup? I host it on a home server. What my home server has changed over the years. So early on, I had like a 26U cabinet, and I had like 1U servers, and I had a crazy power bill. But I was, I was like I was the sysadmin, I was like practicing and sort of like self-training stuff, right? Everyone does that's into system administration at some point. Then the power bill got crazy, and so I started downsizing. So then I did all these system-on-chip things, like Raspberry Pi-like things, so it kind of went all the way to that, like super low power setup. And then more recently, I was like, I started pricing out, I started getting some power outages every now and then in just my neighborhood for various reasons. Like, I have a UPS, but with even my low power setup, it's only lasting like maybe an hour and a half, which is pretty good. But like, well, what would it take for me to get like an 8-hour UPS, right? And you start pricing that stuff out, and then the space and everything else, and it gets kind of insane. I was like, wait. You know what has an 8-hour UPS, a crash cart, and everything else that you would need for a great home server is a laptop. So my current home server is a ThinkPad E540. It has 8 gigs of RAM. I got it on eBay for $38. The great thing about old ThinkPads in particular is, for a server, is depending on the product line, they have Ethernet ports, usually have gig Ethernets. So in my case, this does a couple of things. So I also have an extra dongle to get, so I have 2 Ethernet ports. But basic server, Ethernet ports almost always included. It's popular among the enterprise, so you can always get used ones pretty cheap if you go back a couple of generations. Linux support is almost always great on these old ThinkPads, so you don't have to worry about that. And so yeah, in my case, that's my preferred home server setup now, is some sort of old ThinkPad, because again, when the power goes out, it's going to last for hours. Even when the UPS dies, it's going to last for hours and hours and hours after that, because it has a battery in it, So in my case, there's a couple of different ways that you can host the data for Nextcloud. The default is to like a local sort of file system thing that doesn't rely on a database, which is nice and simple. For my setup, I started that way, but then when I started getting more serious about doing more heavy-duty use of Nextcloud, like a lot of files and a lot of shared other people using the service, then you can also have a MariaDB database backend. So I switched over to that. So that's how I host it myself. I happen to have gig fiber internet. Thank you, Sonic, for providing that in my neighborhood. So that's pretty nice. So for a home server, that means that I feasibly have reasonable speeds if I'm hosting it out of my house. And also, Sonic's very friendly to people who want to host services off their network from their house. They're not trying to find and block ports and stuff. Also, because I'm a sysadmin, I have proper DNS set up. I have HTTPS certs from Let's Encrypt. So all of that is set up on mine, which means I can access it externally. So I have like an external DNS endpoint. I can go to that URL, and I can access it from anywhere in the world if I want to. That said, I mostly use it internally. Most of my file syncing happens on my internal network. I really only sync with it remotely if I'm out and about and my phone may be syncing to it or whatever, checking calendars or something like that. But for the most part, most of the bandwidth is internal. So even if you don't necessarily have gig internet, Ethernet at your house, just the fact that what you're going to mostly use it for is it locally, internally. You don't need a lot of bandwidth normally, unless you're syncing tons of files all the time outside of your home network. So how do you integrate with this with Linux? It's pretty simple, thankfully. If you are, for example, if you're a GNOME user, it's very easy. In GNOME Online accounts, it is one of the account options. In fact, it's the top account option. And you basically just go through that UI. You say, yeah, I would like to connect a Nextcloud account. You tell it the server name, and you tell it your credentials, and you're all set up. There is a chance sometimes I've experienced, sometimes it just works fine depending on the system, and sometimes I find that it might error out by saying I can't find the webdev or some error like that. And find in general across all of these OSs, if you get some sort of weird error when you're first trying to set this up, it's usually because it is trying some sort of default path that isn't the default path that Nextcloud uses for this service. So if you see that error, you basically just manually enter in the full URL, which is whatever your host name is, remote.php/dev, and and then it'll work. When you do this, the host that you do this on will automatically set up calendars and contact syncs. So if you set this up and then you launch the GNOME Calendar app, boom, all of your shared calendars and all of that stuff will start showing up there. Same with you open the Contacts app, all your contacts will start showing up there. In addition, when you open files, there's going to be a Nextcloud item in sort of like the tray, the bookmark tray on the side, where it will provide a WebDAV source to all of your files. So you can click on that, and it sort of does a DAV mount, and then you can sort of traverse any files you've synced from somewhere else. You can traverse all of those from your host. Now, maybe you don't use GNOME. There's like everyone uses something different. That's totally fine. Obviously can't provide an exhaustive guide of how to do it with everything, but in general, things have some sort of DAV endpoint. Whatever app you're using for calendaring or contacts, you would either use their CardDAV or CalDAV support. So CardDAV is a API, a protocol for syncing contact information, and CalDAV, same sort of thing, only for calendaring information. So if you have a calendaring app, it probably has this natively built in. It should. If it's a decent one, and then you can just use that and it'll sync. So for example, this picture's for KDE Contact, which is their contact management system. You can see here how you would use it. Some apps are even, especially on Linux, are OwnCloud or Nextcloud aware. So OwnCloud and Nextcloud are sort of siblings. There's like in a lot of open source communities, there's like there's a fork, and sort of Nextcloud sort of went their own way from OwnCloud, but enough of the fundamentals are the same that a lot of software has OwnCloud support, or they maybe call out both OwnCloud and Nextcloud kind of interchangeably. So if you see OwnCloud instead, you can probably use that if you don't see a Nextcloud specific option. All right, so let's talk about the native app. So what we did so far, we didn't really have to install anything on a client. We just sort of pointed it at the server, and everything synced. But there is a native app, and it's pretty useful. It's available for all the major platforms you want: Linux, Windows, Mac OS, iOS, iPadOS, Android, a lot of different platforms. And what's cool about the native app is what it does is it sets up an automatic bidirectional file sync. So without this, you can go to the Files app and browse and see your files, and you can access them, and then when you access one, it will download it from wherever your Nextcloud server is and then load it. What this does is it'll create a local folder in your home directory called Nextcloud, and you can tell it which of these folders do I want to keep in sync. And that means when you make a local change, it then gets synced up to Nextcloud, and any other clients that you have out there that also have this Nextcloud app can sync that change down to them. And so that way, all of the files stay in sync across however many devices you have that have the Nextcloud app installed. How do you get it? This is generally available in most distribution repositories I've seen, or app stores, or whatever way that you get your software on a system these days. But if for whatever reason you use a special system, that doesn't have it in the store, then you can also just go to the Nextcloud install page, and then they provide basic instructions outside of all of that. Like I said, this keeps a local copy of the file of all these files on each device, which is really nice. However, depending on the size of your files, you may or may not want to sync everything to every device. So say, for example, you install it on your phone, you may not, but you have many, many gigs of files that you're syncing with Nextcloud. You may not want all of those on your phone, but you may want some of them, and you can select through the app which things stay synced on this particular device, which is useful for things like phones. By default, though, if you do have a file share that is a directory that's larger than 500 megs, it will prompt you just to make sure, are you really sure you want to sync all of this data down? And then you say yes, and as you can see here, I have quite a few directories that are pretty large, and it has no problem. I do recommend, so this is like the key for the cross-platform cloud. I recommend, obviously syncing it. If you have a local server on your local network, it's better to do the initial sync on your local network instead of over the internet somewhere if you can, but it works. But yeah, I would say that this app, more than even like the calendaring syncing and stuff that you can do, is key if you want to move between different platforms. It's one of the things that made it so easy for me to move, in my family, to move between different platforms, because all of our files stayed with us wherever we were. And if we made a change to a file on this device, it automatically showed up on all of the other devices. So how do you integrate with Apple? So there's a couple different ways, depending on which OS. So on Mac OS, for instance, there's an official guide. I've noticed sometimes I've gotten errors when I've followed the official guide. Not that necessarily there's anything wrong with the guide, but I can't always vouch for that it's up to date. Maybe it is. I've just hit errors every now and then. Again, usually because of DAV URLs and things. The thing to note is that on Macs and on iOS as well, Nextcloud needs to have HTTPS. These days, they do not allow CalDAV and CardDAV syncs to an HTTP endpoint, so you need to set up a legitimate valid cert, or if you have some sort of self-signed cert, which these days with Let's Encrypt, it's pretty straightforward. If you're going to go to the trouble of building a self-signed cert, you could go to that same trouble and get like a legit cert. So I recommend doing that. So what you do is you go to Settings, Internet Accounts, Add Account, and then there are two different types. There's CalDAV and CardDAV accounts listed in there in Settings, and then you pick each of those independently, and you basically just add your credentials and the URL, the location for your Nextcloud server. If the sign-in fails, which it could, and I've experienced that, if the sign-in fails, you'll get some sort of error that maybe the error doesn't make exact sense anyway when you're looking at it. If that happens, move to Advanced Settings and set the URL manually. And here's what the URL would look like. So that URL points it directly to the DAV endpoint, and that tends to satisfy whatever errors it has. Because again, I think some of these, my theory is that Nextcloud happens to use a different DAV endpoint than maybe some of these other services are expecting, and so you have to point it out. Often it doesn't auto-discover. Once you do this, what you'll notice is your Mac all of the native apps that you might want to use this have synced will sync. So for example, Contacts, Calendar, and Reminders will all start showing up, your calendar events, your contacts, and with Reminders, if you install the Nextcloud Tasks module, then even your Reminders app will have an entry where you can start creating tasks that will sync between your devices as well. And then the next step after this would be to install the Nextcloud app from either the Nextcloud site, or if you use Homebrew, you can use Homebrew to install the Nextcloud app, which I would recommend here. Let me go back to that for a second. So the nice thing about actually I'm going to talk about this later with iOS, so let me go to iOS first, then we'll talk about the app. So with iOS, Calendar and Contacts are very similar. The steps are almost identical. You basically, to set up the calendar, you go to, on your iPhone, you go to Settings, Apps, Calendar, Accounts, Add Account. And then these are very recent instructions. If you've used iOS for a while, they moved how some of these settings are in more recent releases. And older releases, some of the app settings I don't believe were necessarily all under an apps folder. Some of them were more called out. But now you go to apps, you add a CalDAV account, because this is for calendaring. Add the server username and password. And again, if it fails, you go to the advanced settings and set that magic URL that seems to make everything happy. Contacts is really the same sort of steps. The main difference is this one. You're going to add a CardDAV device because contacts use CardDAV and calendar uses CalDAV. You're going to do all of that, same sort of thing, advanced settings, it's the same set of steps. I do this here because I assume some people may want to come back to these slides after the talk if they want to set this up, and you just follow step by step. All right, so in addition, and this is true for macOS too, you want to install the app. In iOS, it has a native app, and here's what part of it looks like. The official App Store has it. Recommend installing it from there, of course. Once you do, you run and you launch it, you'll launch this account wizard. And what it will do is it'll load from the native browser, it will load into your Nextcloud instance and ask you to authorize this connection using your actual Nextcloud login on Safari on your iPhone. Once you do that, you can access all of your files remotely from the Files app. Once you install the app, you can what you'll notice if you launch Files, you'll see a little Nextcloud bookmark kind of in the sidebar, and you can click on that and access all of your files, and it will download and everything. You can also, because you have the app, you can go into the app and set what folders you want to sync, which is pretty useful, especially for a phone. You might want to sync, say, photos or maybe some documents or things like that. You can select which ones. And again, because phones typically have less storage than computers, you probably don't want to select everything if you have a lot of things in your files. I do recommend the initial sync from unmetered Wi-Fi, especially if you have a lot of files. But it's your internet. You can do whatever you want. I'm not your real dad. So also, what I recommend to do is go to settings, and then in the settings, there's a setting for auto upload that allows you to auto sync your photos, which is really handy. This is similar to like an iCloud feature that's really nice on iOS, which is you take a picture and all your photos now are backed up somewhere, right? That's really nice. Nextcloud has that option too. You toggle this on, and then you take a photo, and sure enough, in a little bit, it's in your files once it uploads, and then it's everywhere else. So now let's talk a little bit about some personal anecdotes about what this looks like in practice. So we'll start by saying, like, this is really great to have your own cloud. It opens up a lot of capabilities for you that you wouldn't realize you'd be able to do that's under your own control. It has a lot of the advantages of iCloud without the lock-in. And really, that's like the big, that's sort of like the big disadvantage with iCloud is that it works great within the Apple ecosystem to sync all these things. But if you want to do anything outside of that ecosystem, it doesn't support anything outside of that ecosystem, right? So I found that Nextcloud is particularly powerful when you're using multiple OSs. And my family has a lot of different use cases, and let's get into them. So for example, my wife is a professional writer for both fiction and nonfiction. So we mutually share our calendars. This is the thing that kind of got us into this. We both are using Google Calendars to just keep track of each other's schedules. My son's school also provides a calendar via an iCloud link that you can add to your shared calendars, and you can see all the school events, which is very handy. And so we've done that as well. So it's very easy for us to coordinate our schedules and our son's school schedules and all this stuff using this. She also, as a writer, sometimes she'll write articles, especially nonfiction articles, where she's on location taking photos, and some of these artifacts end up getting pretty large. She might take many, many photos, and so there's a certain, if you have like one photo in a doc you're sharing, then fine, you might email it to an editor. But at a certain point, you reach that file size limit where people don't want you to email, and Nextcloud's been great for that. So she'll just to the editor, and then the editor can click on that and see all the files. It's been very convenient, then they can download them and it's no problem. It's sort of like the same sort of thing you would use with any other sort of commercial service, right? Like Dropbox or anything else, but you control the files and it's on your own device. So, and then finally what she does is she uses calendars, the calendars and contacts are synced between her desktop and her iPhone, so they're all showing up on whatever app she wants to use for each of those, they show up. Easy to follow. All right, and there's my mother-in-law. So my mother-in-law is an accomplished artist. She mostly works in oils. She's actually used Linux for the past 20 years on the desktop. I set her up, so I set her up about 20 years ago when I first married my wife, and they actually preferred it to Windows, and it's not like, Kyle's coming in all the time doing maintenance tests. No, I just sort of threw Ubuntu on a computer, and they just mostly use web browsers, and they use GIMP and things like that. and they prefer it, they like it. So she's been using it for the last 20 years, no problem. It's been and very little maintenance on my part. Every now and then they're like, yeah, we've had this computer for 6 or 7 years. Could we get a new one? Like, okay, let's just get a new one, transfer all the files to a new hard drive, and then you're off and running. Because it's Linux, you can just sort of typically boot it right back up. That said, so she has a really large wooden easel, right? And she puts her canvas on there, and then what she's been doing, she often will use a reference photo when she's doing an oil painting. And what she's done in the past is printed it out. And of course, if you're going to print it out for a reference photo, you want it to be really high quality, really good color. You want the colors to be correct. And that means you're using your best print settings, which means you're going through a lot of ink. And she does this a lot, so she's really going through a lot of ink. And just pretty much wasn't sustainable. And it's also a hassle. But beyond the ink cost, it's just a hassle to be like, okay, now I want to paint this. I have to go and print it out and make sure that it worked out and then tape it to my easel, et cetera. So we had this idea, what if we got her an iPad that she could mount to her easel, because they have nice screens. The color, in particular, what matters is the quality of the color on the screen, because she's painting from this as a reference photo. So the colors need to match the actual photo as much as possible. So got an iPad to mount to the easel. I then installed Nextcloud on the desktop and on her iPad. And then I set it up I pointed to her photos directory on her desktop, which is what she would normally have. She'd go to her photos, I want to print that one. Instead, that's synced to the iPad, and now she's can very easily go to her iPad and go through and find the photo that she wants to paint, and then tap on it, and then it's full screen, and she can even zoom in, if she wants a little bit more detail from the photo to paint, and it's been working really great. All right, how about me, my cross-platform life? So I've been using Linux for about 25 years. At this point, I'm basically on the desktop as well, like primarily using, it's been my primary desktop for this entire time. That said, so for about 5.5 years, I worked at a company called Purism, where I was chief security officer and then president of the company, and we created hardware that ran all free software. I was a big, free software advocate for the company and promoting the value of having free software everywhere. Financial stuff happened, and basically I got laid off because couldn't really, anyway. It was a weird time, let's just say that. After that, because it's like a lot of soul searching, what does it all mean? I've devoted my life to the community and all this stuff. And I think there's probably people around here that you'll see that have been involved in some major free software project, open source company or things like that then had some level of massive burnout. And you'll see them react based on that burnout in some way for some time. Same thing happened to me. And so then, what does it all mean? I've been sacrificing for all this. It's a long story. Well, heck, we can talk about it more over beers later. This is not a therapy session. All that to say, I feel like I need to do appropriate setup to then say, so what I did at that point is I'm going to go all the other way. It's like such a bad breakup. I'm just going to, So I actually said, well, I'm going to try out the Apple ecosystem. I know a lot of people, probably in this room and definitely at scale, perfectly happy doing all their open source development and everything else on a Mac. I'd never used a Mac before, so I'm like, I should try this out and actually know what I'm dealing with, and try it out like a traveler in a foreign land. I'm not going to go into it and try to turn it into Linux. I'm like, let's try to use it like the natives do, and let me use all the native apps and let me speak the local language and all of that stuff. I'm not going to try to put a tiling window manager on my Mac or whatever. Let's just try to use it normally. So that's what I did. Of course, the big challenge with the Apple ecosystem is lock-in, right? It works really well with all of it makes it a very nice experience if you have all Apple devices. If you're trying to do a cross-platform thing, you have mixed results, right? It's kind of baked in to make that difficult. If you're using the native apps, which I was for the most part, I use Firefox, but it favors Apple hardware and services, and if you fall outside of the ecosystem, it's definitely not automatically working, and it maybe requires some work if it works at all. In particular, and you'll see a lot of people sort of complain about this, is that sometimes it can be challenging to get files and other things on and off certain devices, especially if you're trying to do that outside of the ecosystem. Now, if you have an iPhone and a Mac, you can use iCloud and the files will sync back and forth in the settings and it's all great. But if you have an Android device and a Mac, maybe you have to add something special or try to getting the files on and off can be challenging. iCloud is convenient. Again, it syncs files and settings between your apps. It's really great, but it only works for Apple devices. So Nextcloud to the rescue. So to move to the Mac, actually, the funny thing is having Nextcloud already set up on Linux desktop made moving to the Mac way easier. Because all the files were there, so I set up Nextcloud like I just talked about. All my documents, all my photos, all my important files were just automatically on the device. It was just like they were automatically on all my other devices. I even synced a copy of my Firefox profile, which I then just sort of embedded into where it's stored on the Mac, and then my Firefox stuff was all up and running, and it worked fine. And that meant I didn't have to use Firefox Cloud, because everyone wants you to use their cloud, right, for syncing. It's like, yeah, I don't want to sign up for yet another account for that. I have my own cloud, so I can avoid theirs. The Nextcloud app put Nextcloud in the Finder, so I can just open up the Finder and see all my files there and access them. And what I also did was I changed the Finder bookmarks so that my pictures and docs replaced the local equivalents. So then when I just clicked on documents, I'm actually in my Nextcloud documents, a locally cached version. I can make a change, open a document, and then it gets synced everywhere. Same with pictures. Calendars and contacts shows up in native apps, which is great. I could just, again, live this native experience from this land that I never visited before, and everything just kind of worked with Nextcloud seamlessly. And then I used News as a news reader across devices, so I didn't have to use I wasn't using some sort of weird proprietary thing. I just opened up the web browser, load news, reading news, no problem. Same thing with an iPhone, because the other thing about Purism was I was daily driving a Librem 5 phone, which is a phone that runs actual desktop Linux on it, and as part of my whole burnout coping mechanism, I'm like putting all this aside and like, well, what does that leave me with? Well, I guess I could do Google, but I just talked about how I was de-Googlefying my life for the longest time. Like, do I really want to go back to that ecosystem? Not so much, and you're saying, but Kyle, what you could do, did you know that you could take an Android device and then you can install Linux on it, and then you'd have actual Linux, or you can install these other tools that, it's like, I was taking a vacation from that for right now. I needed some time to myself, take a vacation from all of that fiddly stuff, because like, basically I had developed very thick calluses from years of using Linux tools, all the rough edges, I didn't feel a thing, right? Something about this experience basically ripped all of those calluses off, and so I was very sensitive to all of these paper cuts. And so I needed some time to avoid paper cuts. Anyway, so I moved to an iPhone. Like I said, calendars and contacts sync is very seamless. I installed the native app and synced a subset of files, so my photos and all that stuff that I wanted to be on there synced, and it's very convenient. And again, all the photos taken on the phone syncs up to Nextcloud, so I can immediately access it on a desktop. I can immediately access it on other devices. It's great. And again, the News app actually it works well in the mobile browser. You can just scroll through it. It does what you think a modern web app should do on a mobile browser. It behaves appropriately. Now, importantly, it also made it easy to move away from a Mac, because it's not hard to get inside the garden, right? Sometimes it can be hard to leave the garden. And so I did miss Linux on the desktop. It took, I needed to take a vacation. I took my sabbatical, worked through some things, and then I got to a point where I'm looking around like, I kind of miss this, and actually I want to get back and daily drive this. I mean, I had been keeping up with Bluefin on an old ThinkPad. Like I said, you can get those on eBay for under $50 almost always. So this one wasn't. I traded with a friend. But anyway, I had an old ThinkPad. I was like keeping up with Bluefin and trying this stuff. I was like, you know what? I think I'm ready. I think the time is right. I think I'm ready to immigrate back home. So I did. I ended up using Nextcloud. And the great thing about Nextcloud is it made it, even before I had switched to what my daily driver is now, just having Bluefin on this old ThinkPad, Nextcloud made it easy to just, today I'm going to see what Bluefin's like. I'm going to put the Mac aside and just put this on my lap and try it. And all the files were there. Everything was just synced. The calendar was there. All the things, it was pretty seamless to just pick up one device or the other than all the key bindings being different, right? So that was a nightmare. But that's okay. Just like switching from a ThinkPad to something else, the function and control keys are always like different. So you go to like a regular keyboard, it just drives you crazy. You get used to it. It's fine. So I actually chose a Framework 13 as my daily driver. That's what I'm presenting on, and it's fantastic. I couldn't give higher praise for it. I really enjoy it so far. And to test Nextcloud, actually, because I knew I was giving this talk, I did a fresh install. So I didn't just like take a hard drive from something else or just like copy home directories over or whatever. I wanted to see what it would be like, and basically just did a fresh install on this, everything blank, and then installed Nextcloud. and stuff started happening, right? Like stuff started syncing over. I used the file sync to copy over my Mac profile, Firefox profile, which at this point had been updated and changed, right? So I found that folder and put it back in the Nextcloud, and then it was right there for this to copy over the local version of the profile. Calendars, contacts, files just work as you might expect. And then I did things like I updated the home directory, so I symlinked the docs pictures directories to the Nextcloud folder, so then when I'm opening files, the Files app, I can click and it goes right to Nextcloud, like you would expect. What I'm considering now is expanding this kind of sync. A lot of people have way more sophisticated setups for this sort of thing than I do, where they may have multiple Linux desktop devices and all their like dot files and stuff automatically sync between things. I'm considering some of that. I just haven't exactly decided which things I want to do yet. I'm experimenting here and there, so maybe more to come on that. But yeah, so that's another option that I want to look into later. So, conclusion to all of this. Groupware and file sync clouds are very useful. But the problem is some of them reinforce lock-in. Once you kind of get in, you can get in pretty easily, but it's kind of hard to get out. Nextcloud provides all the major features of many of those providers and some features that they don't provide. And it can be self-hosted, which is great. It works across platforms, so it makes switching between them easier, even switching between them the same day easier. And in general, I would say it's a great alternative to iCloud. Like specifically, it's a great alternative to iCloud, but it's also a great alternative to a lot of other groupware solutions. And I think I would recommend it in particular for family groupware. You know, it doesn't require a lot of resources if you just want your family to have some sort of shared thing. It doesn't take a lot, like I said, modern Raspberry Pi, no problem. It should be no problem. So yeah, thank you very much. It's time for Q&A. I really appreciate everyone coming out. Last talk of the day, of the last day. I appreciate your dedication. And yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate it. All right, yeah, question.
One of the nice things about iCloud is the backup, being able to do a backup of a phone or I guess a Mac. I haven't done it for a while. Is it possible to do a time machine backup from the Mac? Is it possible to do a time machine backup from the Mac or from an iPhone to Nextcloud? I think maybe especially the iPhone, or do you find that the normal home directory syncing is enough and you don't really need to do backups?
Yeah, oh yeah, we have the mic so I don't have to repeat it. Great. So I didn't try Time Machine with a Nextcloud folder. I know that Time Machine can be somewhat particular even when you're plugging in an external disk. It needs to be formatted certain ways. So Bill knows. So yeah, so the answer for the crowd was that you can have an SMB mount, although I've heard recently that you have to go in and change a particular protection setting because of SMB, there's issues with the SMB integrity sometimes over the network, so Time Machine can be a little finicky about it. So it's an option, but again, I think what your thing is you'd like the sync, maybe you have multiple Macs and it'd be kind of cool if it's synced across. So for things that were like Apple-centric, I didn't use Nextcloud, for example, to sync my Apple account type stuff because I figured, well, all those things are in that ecosystem, they can just be happy in their ecosystem. And then it's mostly like other files like Firefox profile and stuff. Thanks for the question. Yes?
How does credentials management work in this world? Did you have everybody create credentials on your home system and then have them enter them, like username, password on their devices, or what?
Yeah, so everyone basically username, password. Nextcloud does support have plugins you can add to enable multi-factor authentication if you want to. For my family and our use case and our threat model, I didn't think it was necessary. So basically there's an account management in the UI, and if you're an administrator, which I am there, you can add new accounts. And I would just add accounts with their email and then and set a password, and they can go change it once they log in the first time if they want to. And then, because I'm the one that's setting it up for my family generally, so what happens is I would set up, like for my mother-in-law, I created the account, then I would go to her home, install the Nextcloud app, and like set up the sync and stuff for her, and same with the iPad. But yeah, so that's It's pretty straightforward username, password. Any other questions? Yes.
What's your kind of recommended way, if you have experience with it, to share photos, like from an iPhone? So my buddy here has Nextcloud at home, and we took some photos at his birthday party, and like, for the life of me, I could not figure out how to upload those photos into his Nextcloud, except maybe one by one. But there was like no easy batch, or because I want to upload, like, batch upload a bunch of photos and videos, let's say.
Yeah, so yeah, if you had an Nextcloud account, and you installed the app, then you can set it to auto-sync new photos, right? But that doesn't help. So first step would be to do that. It would auto-sync your new photos. For your old photo, if you want all of your photos,
Right. Not all, just like one album, right?
one album, then basically what you can do is you can set up a sync a folder, like go to the files part of the Nextcloud app, and have a folder that is shared locally, and then you can drag those photos there. So if your Nextcloud account, if you go to files and just create a photos directory, I think they automatically now have like a photos directory in Nextcloud, maybe, but if not, create one. And then on your iPhone, you'll see in the Nextcloud sort of bookmark on the side of the Files app, you'll see when you click on it, like, oh, there's photos, okay. Then you can go to your pictures and select the ones select the album, and then copy it. You just copy and paste, right? You can go back to that Nextcloud photos and say paste, and then it'll sync it.
Oh, so you do it in the Nextcloud app for iOS, basically?
Yeah.
As opposed to like in the web interface?
Yeah, not the web interface. I would
Yeah.
recommend going into the app, and then it'll just sync.
Cool, awesome, thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Any other questions? Yes.
These are comments, I'll admit, rather than questions, but they're helpful. Because
Okay,
I'm a Nextcloud fanboy like you. If you run an organization and it's beneficial to have your logo on your Nextcloud, that's a feature built in. So you basically get to white label it. I use mine with customer-facing support and work with my clients. And they are very impressed when they log in and they see my stuff. They know they're where they're supposed to be. That's a helpful feature. The other thing is, for those of you who enjoy development, the Nextcloud project has been building out rich developer resources to get you started easily making your own apps for anything that isn't in the large collection already in the App Store.
Any other questions?
Any questions?
Well, awesome. Well, thank you. And anyone who was too shy to do it in front of everybody, you can come talk to me after. I'll be around. So yeah, thanks everybody again.